Learning Jewish history is important for all sorts of reasons. For all sorts of reasons. For one, it's a great way to instill Jewish pride. When we learn about our history, we can marvel at the incredible personalities of our past, at the incredible accomplishments of our antecedents. After all, Jewish history is replete with titans, with giants, with exemplars, with the greatest of our species. Jewish history is a story of a small nation, a nation that has been persecuted so severely, but nevertheless effectuating seismic changes in the world. Jewish history, after all, is the story of the people at the vanguard of global progress. So if you want to be a proud Jew, it's important to learn about your history. But it's not just important for your own feelings of Jewish pride. I think that a foundation of Jewish history is also imperative to know how to live as a Jew, how to think as a Jew. When someone has a keen sense of Jewish history, they have a clear picture of what the marching orders of Jewish life are. To understand what we need to do as a nation, to understand what our individual responsibilities are, we must learn about our past. We must learn about the vital mission that was entrusted to our people, that was given to Abraham, perpetuated to his descendants, to get a sense of how far along we have come and how much more there is to go. In the words of Winston Churchill, the longer you could see back, the farther you can see into the future. Jewish history, I think, is also important for another reason, in that it gives context to the challenges and to the struggles of Jewish life today. Anyone with even a basic understanding of Jewish history knows that the Jews have always been subject to some degree of anti-Semitism. Sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's suppressed, and it can rear its ugly head any moment. But we've never seen a time, we've never seen a place where it was completely eliminated. And that's why a Jew with any sense of history always made sure to have a valid passport. You never know when you're going to need to abscond and find a new haven. And today, with the outbreak of the war in Israel, the war, I will remind you, that began with the brutal and fiendish terrorist assault of Hamas, the terrorist organization that has ruled Gaza since 2007. They attacked innocent civilians, killing more than 1,200 men, women, and children, and seizing hundreds of innocents as hostages. Today, in the context of this war, it's important to have a sense of Jewish history for another reason. This war is happening on many fronts. Of course, there's the ground invasion into Gaza, and we know that beneath the surface, there's the labyrinthine Hamas terror tunnel network, and in the air, they're striking down the Hamas targets in Gaza and shooting down rockets from Gaza, from Lebanon, from the Houthis. And there are skirmishes in Lebanon, and we hope that does not escalate. And there are heightened tensions in Judea and Samaria, which is the West Bank. We call it, of course, by its biblical name. There is the international geopolitical diplomatic front in Washington, in the UN, in the European capitals. Of course, there's the weaponry and munitions front. Israel is always trying to secure the weapons that it needs for its operations, those special bunker buster bombs. But there's another front, and that is the war of the propaganda, of public opinion, of support of populations worldwide. All over the world, thank God, there are rallies in support of Israel, in defense of Israel, in defense of Israel's right to defend itself. But also, all over the world, there are rallies in support of Hamas, which I will remind you is a terror organization that targets innocent civilians and has ruled Gaza since 2007. And it's not just on the ground where this battle takes place. I would say that the front lines of this battle is online, on social media, and there's a war. And I will sadly state that unlike the actual war, where it seems, at least to us novices, it seems that Israel's making tremendous progress. Of course, it's taking casualties along the way, and every casualty is a tragedy. If you look on the boots of the ground and the taints and the targeted airstrikes, it seems like Israel's making significant progress in uprooting Hamas. But on this front, the front of public opinion, to capture the hearts and the minds and the support of people worldwide, I'm not sure that Israel's winning. In fact, I fear Israel is losing on the propaganda front. And of course, there are a lot of reasons for this. We can chalk it up to plain old vanilla anti-Semitism. And I think that's partially true. But there's another reason why Israel's not winning on the Hasbara front, and that is because there is gross ignorance of history. When someone's aperture is very narrow, they don't have a broad perspective, it's very easy to manipulate them and to mislead them and misguide them. And they say, hey, they're occupiers, and that's why Hamas attacked. They're justified. And of course, we know anyone with a passing understanding of the history of the region knows that that's just not true. It's baloney. Israel has not occupied Gaza in nearly 2 decades. Israel voluntarily, unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005. The unilateral disengagement, the hitnatkut, as they say in Hebrew. And this was hotly debated. It divided the country asunder. There were 9,000 Jews who lived in 21 settlements in Gaza. And they lived there with a blessing, and they were sanctioned by the government. And the same government that encouraged them to establish homes there pulled them out and handed it to the Palestinians. We're out. Israel voluntarily, unilaterally, now we know quite foolishly as well, destroyed Jewish communities that had flourished in Gaza for decades. They dismantled their homes, they destroyed their shuls, they destroyed their schools, they exhumed their dead, and they exiled them from their homes, where they had lived, again, with the blessing of the state. And Israel also withdrew its security presence in Gaza, which, it seems obvious, helped contribute towards their lack of preparedness for October 7th. So if Israel has not been in Gaza, not ruled it, not settled it, not occupied Gaza since 2005, how can you call Israel occupiers? And of course, anyone with a broader sense of history knows that when Israel did this generous gesture of pulling out, the Palestinians repaid them with more terror. In 2007, 2 years after the disengagement, there was an election. And the Palestinians democratically elected Hamas. Hamas, which has in its charter, their mission is to destroy Israel completely. Not 2 states for 2 people. Destroy, eliminate the entire state, wipe it off the map. And in the past decade and a half, there's been indiscriminate rocket fire on Jewish, on Israeli civilian homes and towns. And who provides water for Gaza? Israel. And who provides electricity for Gaza? Israel. And who facilitates the flow of international cash to Gaza, millions of dollars a month? Israel. And who opened its doors to allow tens of thousands of Gazan workers to enter Israel and to boost the Gaza economy, Israel. And Hamas does not and did not cease from attacking, from raining rockets on Israeli civilians. Israel allows the flow of humanitarian goods, cement, for example, to enter Gaza. And of course, we're told it's to be used to improve the lives of the local population. And Hamas takes all that and uses it to build an enormous network of terror tunnels. And those laborers, many of them, helped contribute towards the heinous attacks of October 7th by helping map out Israeli towns and their vulnerabilities and gave that to Hamas. So how can anyone claim that Israel, they're the occupiers, when they completely left Gaza on its own, unilaterally, in 2005, only with an ignorance of history? Those ignorant of history will repeatedly fall for fabrications. Palestinians are experts at media manipulation and propaganda. There's a whole cottage industry, Pallywood they call it, where they carefully choreograph Zionist, so to speak, atrocities. They fake funerals and they have hired criers, usually old women, very talented. Maybe the Jews control Hollywood, but Pallywood is dominant in this conflict. And the lies are everywhere, and they're brazen, and they're blatant, and they get lapped up by the international press. There's one video where the poor guy, the corpse, the poor thing, he was killed by the awful Zionist aggressors. And then to make matters worse, in the middle of the funeral, fell off a stretcher. What a disgrace to this poor Shaheed. But you won't believe what happened. Miraculously, he was resurrected, came back to life, and climbed back on the stretcher only to die again. Now, you will be surprised to learn that no new religion was spawned from this miraculous resurrection. Recall a few weeks into the war, there was an explosion at a Gaza hospital. And immediately, headlines all over the world blared. Israel bombs Gaza hospital, 500 dead. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Reuters, AP, everyone goes with this, breathlessly reporting this sensational news. Well, it turns out the hospital was not hit. It was the parking lot. And there were definitely not 500 casualties. It's a total lie from Hamas. Oh, and it wasn't even hit by an Israeli airstrike. It was an errant Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which, to keep your organizations here, there are lots of different terror organizations in Gaza. Hamas is the biggest, but there's also the PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They shoot a rocket, it malfunctions, and it lands on the hospital. Oh, and then Israel provided video evidence and audio evidence from the call between two terrorists, and then the Pentagon concluded it was a self-inflicted wound. Actually, about a quarter of rockets fired from Gaza land inside Gaza and damage the Palestinians. But it's too late. The reputational damage is done. And it doesn't matter if you issue corrections or withdraw the story, it just doesn't stick. As Mark Twain said, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. Palestinians are the experts at these lies heard around the world, while Israel is always struggling to put its pants on. Of course, that would be trousers for our listeners who are subjects of Her Majesty the Queen. The Palestinians realized that the penalty for a lie is just going to be outweighed by the propaganda benefits, so they just do it again and again. And thus, the Palestinians are always accusing Israel of all sorts of crimes that are just simply lies, massacres and genocide, poisoning. They're harvesting the Palestinian organs. They're attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Lies, all of them, but they find an audience. And the Arabs advance their propaganda goal. And as we'll learn today, these are not new tactics. These have been around for more than 100 years. The Palestinians don't really have a leg to stand on, as we shall see. When we look at the facts, they have nothing to base their claims upon. So they just embrace the propaganda. And they're so committed to it that they are actually desirous of losing casualties on their side in order to advance the public opinion against Israel. They prioritize propaganda above the lives of their own children. I'm saying that because the Palestinian arch-terrorist Yasser Arafat said it himself. He celebrated this and he encouraged children to go face off against Israeli soldiers and Israeli tanks. And if they get killed, all the better. That would deal a formidable blow against Israel in the propaganda war. But of course, all this only works because there is ignorance of history. You don't realize how many fabrications and lies and propaganda, and you are vulnerable to be misled. And again, this ignorance is rampant. And sadly, it's not just foreigners who are subject to it. Even within our own communities, so many of our Jewish brethren have sadly drunk the Kool-Aid and gotten swept away into supporting our enemies, really their enemies. You have many Jews, young Jews in particular, that they have a noble inclination towards progress and social justice and helping the poor and the underprivileged, and that's fine. That's a good Jewish sentiment. But that could lead them in a twisted way to go identify with our enemies and to go rally in support of Hamas. And if a Jew supports a terrorist who wants to kill Jews and would kill them as well in a second, that is traitorous and that is unforgivable. And I think the blame is the lack of education. If we fail to educate our children, someone else will. And most likely, it won't be someone that we're happy with the perspective that they're going to share. If we don't give our children a sense of history, they will get a distorted view. If we don't instill in our children a love of Israel, an affinity for Israel, they may be swayed in the direction of our enemies. And to this end, I hope to dedicate a lot of time, a lot of effort to prepare presentations on the history and the backstory and the background of the Arab-Israeli conflict and try to approach it from many different angles. We spoke last time about the history of hostage rescues and ransoms. And before that, we spoke about the historical background to the Arab-Israeli conflict up to the end of World War I, so 1917, 1918, when the British codified their intent to work towards the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine with the Balfour Declaration. And for the first time, a major world power endorsed the idea of Zionism. Today, I want to continue telling the story of the fledgling Jewish settlement in the Holy Land after World War I, after the Balfour Declaration, after the British government stated their intention to effectuate a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The British would not be the only ones to have a say in determining the future of Palestine. The victors of the Great War of World War I, the Allies, they got to determine the fate of the captured Ottoman territories, and they did that in the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. This marks the end of World War I, and now it's time to establish a new international order. The U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson, he had a very comprehensive vision for the conference. It's based upon his 14 points. Unfortunately, he suffered a severe stroke, and that severely impacted his abilities. And he was there, but he was just a shell of himself. His wife ran the show, and there wasn't really strong, determined American leadership. And a lot of things happened. Of course, this is a whole very large subject, but there was the establishment of the League of Nations. This is the forerunner to the UN. It was initially championed by Woodrow Wilson, but the United States ultimately did not join, and thus it didn't really have any power, or didn't really unite the world powers, because the greatest superpower did not join. There was, of course, the Treaty of Versailles that imposed very harsh terms on Germany for their role in World War I, territorial losses, disarmament, reparations. Many argue that this was a disaster and ultimately led or contributed towards World War II. The countries of Poland and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia emerged from this conference. But for our purposes, one of the results of the Paris Peace Conference was the mandates system. This was a system to temporarily administer territories that formerly belonged to the Ottoman Empire and to prepare them for self-government. It was a temporary solution where one of the victors of the war would oversee, would govern, would administer these territories until eventually they would hand it off to the local indigenous people. And therefore Lebanon, that was given to the French mandate, and Syria as well was under a French mandate, Iraq under a British mandate, and Palestine, that was placed under a British mandate as well. Now, what lands were included in the British mandate of Palestine? This is a very important point. The initial British mandate of Palestine included the lands on both sides of the Jordan River. The lands that now contain both the state of Israel on the west side of the river and the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Then it was called Transjordan. Both were included. But very early on, the British made a decision to designate all of Transjordan, all of the mandate on the eastern side of the Jordan. It would all go to an Arab state that would be completely empty of Jews. Now, those lands, if you know your scripture, it includes many lands that were historically Jewish, lands that Moshe conquered on the east side of the Jordan. But all of Transjordan, which equaled almost 80% of the entire land, that would first be designated for an Arab state, the state of Transjordan, now the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And all the Jews that lived there were forced to leave. So the bulk of the land of the British Mandate of Palestine, just off the top, would be Jew-free and given to the Arabs. If the Jews hoped to get any land, they'd have to subsist with the roughly 20-25% of the remaining land on the west side of the Jordan. But unlike Transjordan, they'll have to share it with the Arabs, and they cannot displace any Arabs. So if you've ever heard someone saying, well, we have a Palestinian state, it's called Jordan. If you've heard that, this is the historical background of that position. The original British mandate, if things were fair, you would divide into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, and everyone is happy. Instead, almost 80% is off the top, just taken away and designated as an exclusively Arab state. And if the Jews wanted anything, they'll have to slug it out with the Arabs on the west side of the Jordan. Now, it's kind of crazy to think about it, how the British favored the Arabs repeatedly in the years of the mandate, despite the fact that the Arabs always chose the other side. They supported the Ottomans in World War I. They ended up supporting, as we shall see, the Nazis in World War II. And the Jews, they supported the British, and they fought alongside the British in World War I against the Ottomans. In World War I, we have the advent of the Jewish Legion. These were Jews who fought alongside the British against the Ottomans. This legion, that is the brainchild of Zionist leaders, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who's the father of revisionist Zionism, which is the precursor of the Cherut and Likud parties. And together with him was the dashing, one-armed Zionist hero and warrior, Joseph Trumpeldor. Now, this is a very significant development. This is the first all-Jewish military unit that was raised in close to 2,000 years. And this is one of the crucial precursors for the IDF, when all the Jewish paramilitary groups are going to be folded into one unified fighting front with the founding of the state in 1948. But ultimately, this Jewish Legion comprised 5 battalions and about 5,000 men, including such luminaries as David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol III, Yitzhak Ben-Tzvi, the first President of Israel. Both Bens, as they called them, Ben-Gurion and Ben-Tzvi, were expelled from Palestine by the Ottomans. Now, this legion, the Jewish Legion, participated in several of the pivotal battles against the Ottomans, both in the peninsula of Gallipoli and in Palestine proper. After the war, the legion was mostly disbanded, but some remained in service in Palestine, where their services were desperately needed in defense of Jewish settlements and interests. Because once the Balfour Declaration is in place and the Arabs sense that this Zionist dream is being actualized, they intensified their aggression and their violence towards the ascendant Jewish communities. So the Jews, the Jewish Legion, they support the Allies in World War I, yet the Arabs, as they always seem to do, they lose the war, but they win in the post-war negotiations. So almost 80% of the British mandate is quickly set aside for the Arabs, and what's left, the Jews will have to split with the Arabs that remained. Even that would prove to be quite difficult. The Arabs resisted any Jewish state, any Jewish homeland in any part of the land. They did not even tolerate a Jewish presence in the land. The penultimate Ottoman, well, let me rephrase that, penultimate mayor of Jerusalem under Ottoman rule, in his speech to the King Crane Commission in 1919 said, listen to this gives us a sense of the Arab perspective of the Jews, the fledgling Jewish settlements of the land. He said, quote, "It is impossible for us to make an understanding with the Jews or even to live together. Their history and all their past proves it is impossible to live with them. In all the countries where they are at present, they are not wanted. They are undesirable because they always arrive to suck the blood of everybody and to become economically and financially victorious. If the League of Nations will not Listen to the appeal of the Arabs in this country. It will become a river of blood. This abominable speech, dripping with vile anti-Semitism, is indicative of the Arab perspective on the Jews after World War I. And as we shall see from the Arab violence that ensued, he was not the only one who had this sentiment. In 1920, the Arabs launched a series of attacks on Jewish settlements in the land. They attacked, for example, the Jews in a tiny Upper Galilee settlement called Tel Chai, and they killed 8, and they set the settlement ablaze. Among the dead was the aforementioned hero, Joseph Trumpeldor, that one-armed warrior, whose last words, Tov lamut ba'ad artzeinu, it's good to die on behalf of our land. That became a rallying cry, a motto for Zionists the world over. The Galilean city of Kiryat Shmona, the town of 8, the city of 8, was named after the 8 Jews who died defending Tel Chai from the invading Arabs. Now, this Trumpeldor figure, he became a Zionist icon. There were songs written about him and poems, and his writings, his correspondences, his memoirs were published and became part of the Zionist canon. He was lionized by both the right and the left. In fact, the revisionist Zionist movement named their youth movement Beitar after him. Beitar is for Brit Trumpeldor, the covenant of Trumpeldor. That was not the end of the violence that was perpetrated by the Arabs against the Jews in 1920. Also in 1920 were the Nabi Musa riots. This was a violent 4-day riot against the Jews in Jerusalem's Old City, where 5 Jews were killed and more than 200 were injured. The riots were triggered by the soon-to-be Mufti, the religious leader of the Muslim religious leader of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. He incited the violence with an incendiary anti-Zionist speech, replete with false rumors. Oh no, the Jews are attacking. They're attacking the Dome of the Rock. They're attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We're going to hear more about this guy and more about his mendacious accusations as well. Now, when the Arabs began to riot, the British, they withdrew. And they allowed the Arab mob to attack the Jews and to loot their shops. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the founder of the Jewish Legion, he mobilized a force to repel the Arab attack and to prevent further Jewish blood being spilled. And then what happens after the riot? The British come and arrest Jabotinsky. Why? For possession of illegal weapons. Now, they also arrested al-Husseini for inciting violence, but the British are equating, and we see this time and time again, they equate the aggressor with the defender. Oh, look how many Arabs you killed to defend yourself. That's a crime. Of course, this is a pattern that unfortunately will repeat itself again and again, and still does to this day. So Ze'ev Jabotinsky was arrested and convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Al-Husseini, meanwhile, fled bail and ran to the other side of the Jordan, and he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment in absentia, though all Jews and Arabs who were arrested and charged were ultimately pardoned in a generalized amnesty a few months later. Now, after pardoning this terrorist, al-Husseini, for his crimes of inciting violence, the British High Commissioner of Palestine, one Sir Herbert Samuel, he thought it was fitting to appoint him Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. The terrorist, let's reward him. Now, this was easier said than done because it actually demanded the rigging of an election. According to the regulations that were still in place from the Ottoman time, the political leader would get to choose the mufti, but he had to select one of the top three candidates, one of the top three vote getters from a vote that the Arabs would conduct. This Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was part of this Jerusalem clan, and there were different clans, he came in fourth in the election. But the British High Commissioner really wanted him for some naive reason. And he, so to speak, invited one of the top three, why don't you withdraw your candidacy, thus rendering al-Husseini now eligible, and Sir Herbert Samuel selected him. Of course, predicated on a pledge to maintain peace, of course, a vow that he would resoundingly repudiate. Also in 1920, the Haganah was founded. To counter the mounting Arab violence, a Jewish defense force, Haganah, defense, was established. There was an existing Jewish defense militia that was founded in 1909, the Hashomer, the Guardian, but that was small and that was really regionally situated in the north. And the Zionist leaders recognized that there was a need for a national defense organization that would be responsible to guard and to perform the defense duties nationwide. And thus the Haganah was founded. This was a clandestine organization. It was done against the wishes of the British. But their job was, in effect, to provide the security and the defense that the British were either unwilling or unable to provide. Because the British banned this organization and the possession of any weapons, the Haganah had to resort to all sorts of deceptive and creative tactics to get arms, that to purchase them from abroad and smuggle them in all sorts of creative ways. In all sorts of creative ways, they put them in beehives and in refrigerators, and they embedded them in agricultural equipment, and they disguised them as everyday items like construction material. And they would have vehicles or containers with false bottoms or hidden compartments. Even within the land, the Haganah used very creative ways to shuttle weapons from place to place, because the British would always inspect people, stop people, and frisk them. I can't get down to specifics without imperiling the G rating of this podcast, but use your imagination for how they transported weapons throughout the land. And the Haganah, their charter was to take up arms to defend the Jewish towns, the Jewish people, Jewish property, but it was also to advance the cause of Zionism. And that ultimately meant that their mandate, their charter, was to fight against anyone that they deemed harmful to the Zionist cause, even fellow Jews. And thus, when the Zionist establishment, they saw the Dutch Jewish writer, one Jacob Israel de Haan, they saw him trying to undermine the Balfour Declaration. A Haganah officer named Avraham Tehomi, under orders from Haganah leadership, he assassinated him in Jerusalem. And this would be the beginning of what would ultimately become a lot of internal infighting between the Haganah and other paramilitary forces that operated before the founding of the state. primarily the Irgun, and that, unfortunately, often, or at least occasionally, descended into violence. But certainly, before the founding of the state, the services of the Haganah would very much be put to use for the primary role of the Haganah, and that is to defend the Jews from the Arabs. In 1920, it was a year of fierce Arab violence towards the Jewish settlers, but that violence would be greatly eclipsed by the violence of the year 1921. In May of that year, Arab rioters, again instigated by the same old Mufti of Jerusalem, they attacked many Jewish settlements, as well as the Jewish community in Jerusalem, in Petach Tikva, and primarily in Jaffa. For an entire week, the Arabs rioted all over the country, destroying settlements and ultimately slaughtering 47 Jews. And the violence is stomach-churning. They attacked Jewish pedestrians. They destroyed Jewish homes. They broke into Jewish homes and murdered Jews, including children, in their own homes with, again, brutality, in some cases, splitting open the victims' skulls with clubs, with knives, and with swords. And some Arab policemen actually participated in the riot, shooting at Jews, attacking them, and in one instance, attempting rape as well. When some of the victims managed to escape a building that was being assaulted by the mob, they were chased down and beaten to death with iron rods and with wooden boards. In retaliation to this terrible riot, the Haganah launched for the first time a reprisal attack on Arabs, destroying Arab homes, and allegedly, it's still debated, even killing some Arab civilians, though no Haganah members were charged with any crime. It's important to mention the heroic action of a British officer, one Major Lionel Mansell June. He was the commander of the Jaffa port, and he is credited with saving the lives of 100 Jews because he took some firm steps to stop the riot, and he dispersed some of the murderous mob and prevented further innocent death. Now, in the aftermath of these terrible riots, the British High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, he decided once again to reward the perpetrators. Samuel, he himself was actually Jewish, which may have been part of the cause of the problem. He may wanted to seem to be an impartial player. He's always bending over backwards to accommodate the Arabs, to appease them, to grant them concessions. Instead of punishing them, he tries to appease them by temporarily restricting Jewish immigration. Perhaps he was naive. Perhaps he wanted to quash any claims of partiality for the Jews. Maybe he overcorrected for that. But he rewarded the Arabs for their violence. And again, this is a pattern that repeats itself over and over and over again in the story of the Arab-Jewish conflict of the last 100 some odd years. And we know if you incentivize behavior, you'll get more of it, not less. For some reason, the British thought it was appropriate to incentivize the same behavior that they claim to want to minimize. And of course, you'll be shocked to learn that Sir Samuel's gesture of goodwill did not quite pacify the Arabs. In the same year, 1921, in November, further Arab riots broke out in Jerusalem, resulting again in more dead Jews. And again, the victims were punished and Jewish immigration was slowed again. But nevertheless, over the course of the 1920s, tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants did manage to enter the land, and they kept at it. They kept building the land, investing in the land, investing tremendous energy and resources to build the infrastructure, the electric, the waterworks, the sanitation, the roads, establishing cooperatives and newspapers and sports organizations and buying up more land and establishing more towns and more settlements and more communities and more moshavs and more kibbutzim, building hospitals, building healthcare facilities, and of course, advancing the agriculture, irrigating the malaria-infested swamps, making the desert bloom again. And it's hard to avoid noticing the fulfillment, or what seems to be the ostensible fulfillment of the prophecies. The land, we're told in the prophecies, will become barren, a barren wasteland when absent of the Jews. The land bloomed and blossomed with their return. And as you mentioned in the past, the Jews only built on land owned by Jews. And they took great care to respect the rights of the Arab inhabitants. Ben-Gurion, after the Balfour Declaration, when he was still in the United States trying to advance the cause of Zionism, he wrote categorically, this is a quote, "Both the vision of social justice and the equality of all peoples that the Jewish people has cherished for 3,000 years and the vital interest of the Jewish people in the diaspora, and even more so in Palestine, require absolutely and unconditionally that the rights and the interests of the non-Jewish inhabitants of the country be guarded and honored punctiliously." The Jews thought that coexistence, that would benefit everyone. And they built the land. And it wasn't easy. And it was very hard. And many immigrants died of malaria. And many were unemployed. And there wasn't really enough food for everyone. And many left due to the harsh economic conditions. But slowly and gradually, the Zionist dreams were being actualized. The Jews were coming home. And I want to stress that the building of the land, that was not limited to the physical, to the material elements of the land. It was also true on the spiritual dimensions. In 1924, the great Rabbi Avraham Grudzinski, one of the heads of the Slobodka Yeshiva in Lithuania, he arrived in Hebron, with a cadre of exceptional Torah scholars. And he founded the Hebron Yeshiva, a branch of the famed Slobodka Yeshiva in Lithuania. It opened in the Holy Land. The Jewish emigres suffered tremendously from Arab violence, and the spiritual emigres suffered alongside the rest of the pioneers, as we shall see. Now, throughout the 1920s, the cycles of Arab violence continued, but after 1920 and 1921, it was sporadic, it was episodic, until it wasn't. In 1929, a set of horrific riots and massacres were perpetrated against Palestine's Jews. And again, the instigator is the Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini. He, once again, spread false rumors. The Jews have a plot to control the Muslim holy sites. They're killing Arabs left, right, and center. They attacked the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. I guess Pally would, like Hollywood. They love them sequels. But all kidding aside, these rumors were completely false. But nevertheless, Arab violence erupted on a scale never before seen. And the cruelty and the violence and the barbarism, it's really unfathomable. In Jerusalem, the Arabs started an attack on Jews in the Old City. And while Jews were being killed at the Jaffa Gate in full view of the British policemen, they didn't open fire onto the Arab crowd. Maybe they were scared that the mob would turn their anger against them, but they did nothing or did little to stop it. And throughout Jerusalem, the Arabs rioted and they looted and they behaved with savagery. And the British did little to stop them, even refusing to arm the Jews to enable them to defend themselves. And the attacks spread beyond Jerusalem to nearby settlements. Again, a rampage of killing, of destroying, of looting, of burning. Devastation was unleashed. In the Jewish village of Moza, the Jews had relatively good relationships with the Arabs nearby. But there's a terrible story of what happened to the Maklef family and how they were killed by the Arab rioters. And the rioters included a policeman, an Arab policeman, and also a shepherd, an Arab shepherd who worked for this family. They killed the father, they killed the mother, they killed the son, 2 daughters and 2 guests. And again, the brutality is inhuman. The mother, she was initially tortured, and then she was hanged, and she died. The 2 daughters were raped, and they were murdered. And one son, Mordechai, he survived by escaping out of the second-story window, and he was raised by relatives in Jerusalem and Haifa, and he actually became a very significant personality. He became the 3rd chief of staff of the Israeli army. But the most brutal massacres of the 1929 riots occurred in Hebron and in Tzfat, in Hebron and Tzfat. This is in August of 1929. Hebron, of course, that's the city of the patriarchs. That's where Abraham and Sarah are buried. Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, they're all buried in the cave of Machpelah. That cave that we read about in Genesis, Abraham purchased from Ephron the Hittite, 400 silver coins. At the time, there was a small Jewish contingency in Hebron, about 600, 700 Jews. And the Arabs unleashed a heinous, brutal, unprovoked attack on the innocent Jews of Hebron, killing, raping, mutilating, dismembering, and of course, looting. And we have accounts. We have eyewitness accounts of these massacres. And it's very difficult to read. If you're squeamish, you should maybe stop here. Skip the next few minutes. But I think it's important to know and to perpetuate. We have to know our enemy. We have to know the kinds of people that we're up against. So let's start. The British High Commissioner at that time was a Sir John Chancellor. And he wrote in a letter to his son, this is a quote describing the Hebron massacre. The horror of it is beyond words. In one house I visited, not less than 25 Jewish men and women were murdered in cold blood. Recall how the Slobodka Yeshiva opened a branch in Hebron in 1924? The Arabs in Hebron, they butchered and massacred many of the yeshiva students. In fact, the first to be murdered was a 24-year-old yeshiva student named Shmuel Rosenholz. And when they began their riot on Friday, this is Friday, August 23rd, 1929, they descended upon the yeshiva building, but it's a few hours before Shabbos. Everyone's getting ready for Shabbos. This one student, he had already prepared for Shabbos, and he was in the study hall studying Talmud by himself. And these beasts, they crushed his skull with a large rock and repeatedly stabbed him with daggers, thereby drenching the book of Talmud that he was studying with blood. Now, as a way to escape, or to try to escape, the riot, many Jews sought refuge in the house of one Eliezer Slonim. He was someone who had somewhat friendlier relationships with the Arabs. He was the son of the old rabbi in Hebron. He was a member of the city council. He was a director of the Anglo-Palestine Bank. If you're with him, you're safe. And he offered to take the Jews of Hebron as to shelter in his house. And they went there Friday night. But the mob stormed the house on Saturday morning. And they said, we'll spare all of Hebron's Sephardic Jews if you hand over the yeshiva students that were hiding in your home. And of course, he refused. And they shot him on the spot. They shot him, they shot his wife, and they shot his 4-year-old child. And these monsters, they entered the house, and they began a slaughter of horrific proportions. And we have a lot of contemporaneous accounts. I want to read you a few of these accounts. And again, if you're squeamish, just check out. This is a quote from a book called The Wandering Jew Has Arrived, written by a non-Jewish French author that spent a lot of time, a writer really, spent a lot of time in Palestine in the late 1920s. He summarized this attack in Hebron. This is a quote. Here's the story in a nutshell. They cut off hands, they cut off fingers, they held heads over a stove, they gouged out eyes. A rabbi stood immobile, commending the souls of his Jews to God. They scalped him. They made off with his brains. On Mrs. Sokolov's lap, one after another, they sat 6 students from the yeshiva and, with her still alive, slit their throats. They mutilated the men. They shoved 13-year-old girls, grandmothers, mothers into the blood and raped them in unison. These are descriptions that are just, we cannot fathom such cruelty. And this is just, again, this is only some of the accounts. The other accounts talk about castrations and torture and mutilation and beheading of babies and disemboweling and burning alive and widespread rape. I want to mention some relatives of mine that perished. My grandmother's uncle, I guess that's my great uncle. His name was Rabbi Moshe Grudzinski. He was tortured before he was killed. These animals, they gouged out his left eye and they cut out his brain. And his son was also killed with an axe. And his daughter-in-law, Leah, she was mortally wounded, and she lay for 3 days in Bikur Cholim Hospital before she too passed away. After this riot, the British assembled a commission to investigate what happened. This is known as the Shaw Commission, and the report talks about what happened, and they described the Hebron massacre as, quote, unspeakable atrocities. Here's another quote. Arabs in Hebron made a most ferocious attack on the Jewish ghetto, so the Jewish part of the city, And on isolated Jewish houses lying outside the crowded quarters of the town, more than 60 Jews, including many women and children, were murdered, and more than 50 were wounded. This savage attack, this is the British talking, of which no condemnation could be too severe, was accompanied by wanton destruction and looting. Jewish synagogues were desecrated. A Jewish hospital, which had provided treatment for Arabs, was attacked and ransacked. In his official condemnation of this event, the aforementioned British High Commissioner, John Chancellor, said the following: "These were atrocious acts committed by ruthless and bloodthirsty evildoers. These are murders perpetrated upon defenseless members of the Jewish population, accompanied by acts of unspeakable savagery." In total, 67 Jews were killed, including 24 students of the Hebron Yeshiva. The British evacuated the 480 some odd survivors. They relocated them to Jerusalem. The Hebron Yeshiva actually relocated to Jerusalem, and it still exists there today. In fact, it's one of the largest and most prestigious yeshivos in the world. As an aside, this is very pertinent to our studies. The PA, so these are the moderate ones, right? The Palestinian Authority, they're moderate. And they're run by this real moderate Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, as he's known. If you could just get past his dissertation of Holocaust denial, he's moderate. And he'll be a partner for peace. Every single year, the PA celebrates and commemorates these terrorists who did these horrific, savage, brutal attacks in Hebron, and they commemorate them and they celebrate them as heroes, and they have a ceremony to honor them. I wonder why there's no peace. But the 1929 riots continued, and the final area where the Arab rioters massacred Jews was in Tzfat, in the iconic Galilean city. And again, I want to read you from the Shaw report. At about 5:15 on the 29th of August, Arab mobs attacked the Jewish ghetto in Safed, in Tzfat, in the course of which some 45 Jews were killed or wounded. Several Jewish houses and shops were set on fire, and there was a repetition of the wanton destruction which had been so prominent a feature of the attack at Hebron. And again, it was an orgy of macabre barbarism and brutality, butchery and mutilation and murder. I want to read to you another contemporaneous account from David HaKohen. He was a resident of Tzfat, and he would go on to serve as an Israeli politician in the Knesset. He wrote this in his diary, quote, "We went down alleys and steps of the old town. Inside the houses, I saw the mutilated and burned bodies of the victims of the massacre, and the burned body of a woman tied to the grill of a window. Going from house to house, I counted 10 bodies that had not yet been collected. I saw the destruction and the signs of fire. The local Jews gave me a detailed description of how the tragedy had started. The pogrom began on the afternoon of Thursday, August 29th, and was carried out by Arabs from Safed, from Tzfat, and from the nearby villages, armed with weapons and tins of kerosene. Advancing on the street of the Sephardi Jews from Kfar Meron and En Zaitim, they looted and set fire to the houses, urging each other on to continue with the killings. They slaughtered the school teacher. It gives the name over here. Afriat, maybe that's Efrat, I don't know. Together with his wife and mother, they cut the lawyer Toledano to pieces with their knives, bursting into the orphanages. They smashed the children's heads and cut off their hands. I myself saw the victims. Yitzchak Mamon, a native of Tzfat, this is again part of the quote, who lived with an Arab family, was murdered with indescribable brutality. He was stabbed again and again until his body became a bloody sieve, and then he was trampled to death. Throughout the whole pogrom, the police did not fire a single shot. They were the only ones with guns, and they did nothing. That's why the Arabs had to use the more primitive tools. One final quote here I want to read to you. This is from a Scottish missionary who was working in Tzfat at the time. One of our church members came running to tell us that all the Jews are being killed. A few minutes later, we heard women shrieking their jubilant refrain from the Muslim quarter, and saw men running with axes and bludgeons in their hand, urged on by women. We heard rifle and machine gun fire all around us. Wild Arabs had come up from the valley unexpectedly into the Jewish quarter and began at once a systematic slaughter of the Jews. Some escaped with injury, only, but 22 were killed outright in the town. The inhumanity of the attack was beyond conception. Women were gashed in the chest. Babies were cut on the hands and feet. Old people were killed and plundered. At the end of all this rioting, the death toll stood at 133 Jews. Now, why did I read all that to you? Why do we have to hear that? Why is it important for us to know that? I think it's important for us to know that because these same sorts of atrocities happened a few weeks ago. It didn't happen in a vacuum. This sort of behavior, this sort of cruelty and brutality that we can't even listen to them. It's so painful. It's endemic to the people who perpetrated it. There has been Arab and Muslim violence of this type for 100 years in the land. And again, these are levels of cruelty and brutality that's totally foreign to our people and truthfully to decent people worldwide. And remember, in 1929, there was no state of Israel yet. And there was no illegal occupation. And there was no illegal settlements. Someone who tells you that the settlements are the problem, the quote-unquote occupation, doesn't know their history. What there was then that still is today is an Arab populace, not all of them, of course, but with enough people that maintain a position of complete and total intolerance for any Jewish settlement in any parts of the Holy Land. And when they talk about they want Palestine to be free from the river to the sea, this is what they mean. They want the entire Holy Land completely empty of any Jews. And they will resort to unspeakable violence to do it. Of course, the story is not yet over. The Arab violence against the Jewish settlers in the land was fierce and was intense in the 1920s, but it escalated precipitously in the 1930s. And it became more organized and coordinated and deadly. And the Jews themselves failed to get along. And the British began to plan for their exit. They sought to divest themselves of this mess. A lot happened in the 1930s, and please God, we will cover it next time on the Jewish History Podcast. Please God, in good health and in good spirits, and hopefully with good news from our brethren in Israel. Hopefully we heard good news, only good news from Israel, the hostages and the soldiers and the populace. Hopefully things will improve, but now we know what the face of the enemy really is. Of course, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the great work of Torch in the year 2023, we still have some time. You can visit our website, torchweb.org. You can pitch in. Again, looking forward to hearing good news, only good news, from our brethren in the Holy Land. Until next time, again, the email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.